The wind howled through Pine Grove Valley as I stood on the creaky porch of my childhood home, clutching the keys to Mom's farmhouse. It had been 15 years since I last set foot here, but her death dragged me back to a place I'd sworn to leave behind. Mr. Jenkins, her old lawyer, handed me a thick folder, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "This is yours now, all 2,100 acres of Johnson family farmland, just like your mother wanted." The cornfields stretched out before me, their golden stalks bending in the breeze as if paying respects to her memory. She painted the wooden railing blue every spring, a ritual I could still picture, though now the paint chipped under my fingers. Tears stung my eyes, but I fought them back. There was too much to do. Mom had battled cancer for years, keeping this land alive through sheer will, and now it was mine to protect. My phone buzzed work again. As Northeast Power Authority's regional supervisor, I'd taken emergency leave and my bosses weren't thrilled. But what choice did I have? She was gone, and someone had to sort through the wreckage of her life. A sharp knock jolted me from my thoughts. Through the screen door, I saw a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, Corinne Thompson, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, flanked by two men in polo shirts bearing their logo. Her smile was all teeth, no warmth. "You must be Helen Johnson's son," she said, extending a manicured hand. "We were so sorry to hear about your mother." I shook it, wary. "Thanks, but what brings the HOA out here? This farm's not part of your development." Her smile tightened. "Well, that's why we're here. There are some covenant violations we need to discuss." I blinked, incredulous. "Covenant violations? This farm's been here since 1920. Your neighborhood, what, 10 years old?" 15, she corrected. "And while that may have been true once, your mother never contested our annexation of this property 5 years ago. It's under our jurisdiction now." My stomach lurched as she handed me an official-looking document, Mom's signature scrawled at the bottom. It didn't look right, something was off, but before I could argue, she pointed at the barn. "Those farm vehicles violate our storage ordinances, and that fence needs to meet code. You've got 30 days before fines start." They left in their luxury SUV, orange survey stakes glinting along the cornfield's edge, new since Mom's funeral 3 days ago. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Mom's paperwork sprawled across the kitchen table, tax forms, medical bills, land deeds from my great-grandfather's time. Corinne's document gnawed at me. Why would Mom sign away our land? I dragged her locked filing cabinet from the office, using the key from the chain she'd worn till her last breath. In the bottom drawer, beneath old photo albums, I found a leather-bound journal labeled "Keep Fighting." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were detailed notes: HOA harassment over her tractor, complaints about roosters, threats about corn height. Worse, she documented land surveys shifting, property markers moving overnight, and HOA members trespassing. The final entry, dated 3 months ago during her last chemo round, read, "They're taking advantage of my sickness. I don't have the strength to fight anymore. God forgive me for failing to protect what my father and his father built." A sticky note on the last page bore a phone number and a name: Sarah Winters, attorney. "Call when you're ready to fight back." Outside, a car crept by, headlights off. Through the curtains, I saw Corinne snapping photos from her Mercedes. Sleep was impossible now. I had proof they'd forged her signature while she lay dying, and they had no idea who they were up against. The kitchen table became my war room, Mom's journal and the HOA's forged annexation papers side by side under the dim glow of a lamp. My hand steadied as I compared her real signature, looped and firm on bank statements, to the shaky scrawl on Corinne's documents. They didn't match, not even close. By dawn, 3 truths burned in my mind. The HOA had falsified records, they'd exploited Mom's illness, and they didn't know I controlled the region's power grid as Northeast Power's supervisor. Sarah Winters' office smelled of coffee and old books, her walls lined with clippings of victories against corporate giants. "This is criminal," she said, adjusting her glasses as she studied Mom's evidence. "Those signatures don't match, and look, the dates line up with hospital stays when she couldn't even hold a pen." I nodded, pointing to a forged agreement from July 17th. Mom had been in surgery that day. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "The HOA's been pushing boundaries for years, planning a luxury development, harvest estates on your eastern fields. Your mother fought them every step." "So what's next?" I asked. "File criminal charges for fraud and get a court order to stop them," she replied. "But the Meadowbrook Association has deep pockets and connections. Corinne's husband, Jack, is on the county zoning commission. This won't be easy." My phone buzzed, a work emergency, a power outage in Sector 7. I've got to handle this, I told Sarah, but let's move forward with everything. She promised to draft the paperwork while I drove home to change, spotting Doug Wilson, the HOA treasurer, hammering no trespassing signs 50 feet into our cornfield. "What are you doing?" I demanded. He smirked, barely looking up. "Marking HOA property. Board meeting tonight about developing this section." "This is Johnson land," I shot back. "Not according to county records," he said. "Prove they're fraudulent." "Oh, I will," I replied, keeping my voice even. After fixing the outage, I hit the county records office. Mrs. Patel, the clerk and an old friend of Mom's, greeted me with sad eyes. "Strange things happened with your mother's property last year," she said, pulling digital files. "These lot boundaries changed 3 times in 6 months, each time swallowing more of your land into Meadowbrook." "Who filed them?" I asked. "Jack Thompson for the Zoning Commission," she replied, handing me a USB drive with copies of originals and alterations. "Your mother helped my son get an engineering scholarship. I haven't forgotten." Corinne's email hit my inbox that evening. An official notice of community development plan for Harvest Estates. 60 luxury homes on our eastern cornfield. Construction starting in 5 days. My work laptop pinged next, flagging power capacity issues for Sector 12, our farm's grid sector. Opening the utility maps, I saw it. Any major development here needed my department's approval for infrastructure upgrades. The current grid couldn't handle 60 homes without millions in updates I had to sign off on. Corinne called then all business. "We need to discuss fence height regulations and those unsightly farm vehicles." "Actually," I cut in, "we need to talk about fraudulent land claims and forged signatures." She paused. "You know nothing about real estate law. That land's ours. Construction starts next week." "Funny thing about developments," I said coolly, "they need power approval from Northeast Power, usually a formality, but not when the supervisor finds fraud." "Who do you work for?" she asked, voice tight. "Northeast Power. I oversee the county grid, including Meadowbrook. See you at the HOA meeting tomorrow. Bring Jack. We've got property lines, forged signatures, and power requirements to discuss." I hung up, her uncertainty ringing in my ears. Texts from HOA board members flooded in, but I ignored them, walking the farm's edge as the sun dipped low. The soil under my fingers tied me to generations past, Mom, Dad, my great-grandfather. "I won't let them take this," I whispered. Back inside, I marked the true boundaries on property maps beside grid plans. They thought they'd won, but they were about to learn who Helen Johnson's son really was. The roar of engines yanked me from sleep before my alarm, a guttural noise that shook the farmhouse. I stumbled to the window, heart hammering. Yellow bulldozers were tearing down the ancient maples along my cornfield's edge. Corinne Thompson, in a garish pink suit, directed 5 workers in bright vests as another century-old tree crashed down. I grabbed my phone, dialing Sheriff Miller while yanking on boots. "They're destroying my property," I shouted, racing outside in pajamas. "I'll be there in 10, he promised. I waved my arms at the workers, voice raw. "Stop, you can't do this." Corinne spotted me, her smile venomous. "Good morning, neighbor. Perfect day to start our development, isn't it?" "This is my land," I growled, fists clenched. "You have no right." She tapped her clipboard smugly. "We have every right. The Meadowbrook Association owns this parcel now." Sheriff Miller's cruiser screeched up, lights flashing. He stepped out, mustache twitching with irritation. "What's happening here?" Corinne handed him a folder. "Phase 1 of Harvest Estates, all permits in order." He flipped through, squinting, then looked up. "Ma'am, these permits are for Lot 156. County records say this is Lot 27, still Johnson Family Farms." Corinne's grin faltered, then snapped back. "A paperwork mix-up. Our plans were approved months ago." "Not for this spot," I countered. "My mother never signed this over." My work phone blared, substation down, thousands without power. "I've got to take this," I told the sheriff. "Please stop them from ruining more." He nodded. "I'll hold them till we sort it." Corinne's voice rose as I walked away, shrill with indignation. For 3 hours, I wrestled the grid emergency, rerouting power while my mind churned over the felled trees, my great-grandfather's legacy reduced to splinters. Back home, the bulldozers were gone, but an acre lay ravaged, stumps bleeding sap into torn earth. Sheriff Miller had halted them, yet the damage stung deep. At the mailbox, I found no reprieve. Cease and desist notices plastered my barn and fence, red letters screaming I was obstructing community improvements. Fines and lawsuits loomed if I didn't comply. My hands trembled as I called Sarah. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said. "Don't touch those notices, document everything." Sleep eluded me again. Mom's papers blanketed the table, journals, records, maps. A year-old entry jumped out. Karen stopped by about selling the East Field, told her no. Later found survey stakes at the line, something's wrong. I opened my work laptop, pulling up the county grid. Meadowbrook's power flowed from substation 12, one I'd overhauled last year. A text from Emma, my friend at the clerk's office, buzzed in. "Found something weird in the land records. Meet tomorrow." Thunder rolled as rain tapped the roof, mirroring the storm in my chest. I studied Substation 12's emergency protocols, an idea flickering. If the HOA wanted dirty tricks, I'd show them who held the real leverage. I listed allies: Sarah, Sheriff Miller, Mrs. Patel, Emma, people who'd stand with me for Mom's justice. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was personal. The HOA meeting loomed the next night, Karen oblivious to my presence as I slipped into the packed community center. She preened at the front table in a red blazer, papers neatly stacked. Sarah stood beside me with Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Olson, and Mr. Diaz, old-timers who'd known Mom forever. The secretary called order. "First item, Harvest Estates updates." Karen rose, smug. "Despite minor setbacks, the Johnson property, secured, construction resumes next week." My blood surged. "Excuse me," I called, stepping forward. "I'd like to address the board." Karen's smile froze as whispers rippled. "This is a closed meeting," she snapped. Sarah countered. "As legal counsel for the Johnson family, my client has rights regarding his property." Karen relented, teeth gritted. 2 minutes." I hooked my laptop to the projector, voice steady despite my racing pulse. "I'm here to show how this HOA stole 2,100 acres from my dying mother." The room hushed, and I knew this was where the fight truly began. The community center fell silent as my words hung in the air, every eye locked on me. I clicked the projector, displaying the forged annexation page dated July 17th. "This is the HOA's claim, my mother's signature supposedly signing over our land," I said, voice firm. "But here's the truth." The next slide showed hospital records. July 17th, Mom in emergency surgery, unable to sign anything. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed, but she shot back. "That's ridiculous, she signed voluntarily." "Did she?" I countered, flipping to more documents. 5 agreements all signed when she was in surgery, medicated, or unconscious. Mrs. Olson, a wiry woman with 50 years in Pine Grove, stood. "That farm was here before your houses. It's theirs." Karen banged her gavel. "Order, this is out of hand." Sarah stepped up. "The Johnson families filed complaints with the county, fraud and elder abuse. A criminal investigation's pending." Board members shifted uneasily. Tom, a gray-haired man, frowned at Karen. "You said this was legitimate." "It was," she insisted, voice shrill. "We've invested hundreds of thousands." I clicked to my final slide, the county power grid. "There's another issue. As Northeast Power's regional supervisor, I've reviewed your plans." I set my ID on the table. "Harvest Estates would overload Substation 12, risking fires." Doug, Karen's husband, leapt up. "You can't block this with your job. That's a conflict." "It's my duty to reject unsafe plans," I said coolly. "Your homes need triple the current capacity. Upgrades take 18 months and millions neither the county nor power company has budgeted." Chaos erupted, homeowners shouting, board members whispering. Karen yelled, "Outrageous, you can't do this." "I just did," I replied. Tom raised a hand. "I move we pause Harvest Estates until these allegations are resolved." Another board member seconded it fast. Karen's eyes blazed. "You don't understand what's at stake." But the vote passed overwhelmingly. Doug slipped out, phone in hand, glaring at me. After, Sarah grinned. "Better than expected, but they'll fight back hard." "Let them," I said, feeling a flicker of strength. Outside, Mr. Jenkins warned, "Your mother'd be proud, but watch yourself. The Thompsons hate losing." I nodded, spotting Karen and Doug with 3 suited men across the lot, their cold stares piercing me. Driving home, stars glittered above, Mom's favorite country song on the radio about standing your ground. The farm lights welcomed me, a fragile victory glowing. Then my headlights hit the barn, red spray paint screamed, "This isn't over." My breath caught. Inside, the house was trashed. Mom's journals, photos, records strewn across the floor. On the table, a typed note. "Everyone has secrets, even your mother, even you." My hands shook as I called Sheriff Miller. This war had turned personal, and they'd drawn first blood. I woke shivering in darkness, no power, though Meadowbrook's streetlights glowed smugly outside. My phone buzzed with texts from friends. Emergency HOA meeting last night. Karen says you're stealing electricity. They're coming for your land today. Be careful. I grabbed Mom's flashlight. Circuit breaker was fine. They'd cut me off deliberately. Karen's voice slithered from the fence line as I stepped out. Going somewhere important. She stood with Doug and two suited men. What do you do to my power? I demanded. We found illegal connections from our development to your property, she said loudly, performative. The power company's investigating. That's absurd. This farm's had legal power for 70 years, she smirked, offering papers. Sign these new boundary agreements and we'll resolve it. Cars lined the road, people filming, a news van parked. This was a setup. Get off my land, I growled. Doug unrolled a map, new lines slicing through my house. According to our latest survey. I drove to work, desperate to fix this, but found my office locked. My boss, Richard, handed me an envelope, eyes averted. You're on leave, investigation into misuse of authority. What investigation? Jack Thompson filed it yesterday, he muttered. He's vice chairman. They'd cut my power, trashed my reputation, and neutered my leverage all in one night. The sting of betrayal burned as I sat in my truck, hands trembling on the steering wheel. Jack Thompson, Karen's husband, vice chairman of Northeast Power's board, had orchestrated this perfectly. Power cut, job suspended, reputation smeared. My phone rang, an unfamiliar number breaking the silence. Johnson Farm? A gruff voice asked. Yes, who's this? Dave Miller, Channel 8 News. Got a tip about illegal utility connections at your property. Care to comment? Before I could respond, engines roared. Through the rearview mirror, I saw 3 bulldozers bearing the Harvest Estates logo barreling down my driveway, trailed by trucks with armed security guards. I gunned it home, skidding to a stop as Sheriff Adams pulled up. You can't let them do this, I shouted, leaping out. He handed me a document, face grim. New emergency court order. Judge Phillips signed it an hour ago. Phillips, Karen's uncle. I scanned the paper. My hands were tied until a hearing next month. Something stinks, he muttered. But I've got no choice. Security set up a perimeter as bulldozers tore into my western field, news cameras rolling from the road. Helpless, I retreated to Mom's storm cellar, the one place they couldn't watch. Rows of preserves lined the walls, her emergency stash a quiet testament to her strength. What would you do, Mom? I whispered, tracing the shelves she'd built. Behind a loose board, something glinted, metal. I pried it open, revealing a rusted box I'd never seen. Inside, yellowed papers spilled out. Original land grants, 1800 surveys, photos of my grandfather with county officials. My breath hitched at a 1952 power grid agreement, a clause circled in faded red. In perpetuity, the Johnson family retains override authority for any utility modifications affecting their granted easements. Beneath it, another journal, Mom's handwriting chronicling HOA harassment, threats, and recordings on flash drives. Always have a backup plan, she'd written. Remember who owns the power lines through our land. A crash above snapped me back. Through the cellar window, I saw guards ransacking my house, breaking windows. Clutching the documents, I grinned. They thought they'd won, but Mom had left me an ace. 3 news vans clogged the courthouse lot days later. I gripped my briefcase, Mom's hidden papers inside, as Karen hissed past me. You won't win, we're already building. I hadn't slept in 2 days, prepping with Sarah, living without power. Judge Reynolds, stern and silver-haired, banged her gavel. This case involves serious allegations. Mrs. Thompson, your HOA claims ownership via annexation papers signed 5 years ago. Mr. Johnson, you allege fraud. Begin. Karen's lawyer strode forward. The Meadowbrook Association legally annexed this abandoned farmland. Mrs. Johnson signed these. He offered a folder. Abandoned, I whispered to Sarah. Mom never left until they hospitalized her. Judge Reynolds studied the signatures. These seem in order, Mr. Johnson. Sarah rose. Your Honor, first, my client's wrongful termination from Northeast Power, based on false claims by Jack Thompson, who hid his conflict as Karen's husband, must be addressed. They stand to profit millions, murmurs spread. Further, the HOA cut his power to intimidate him. Karen's attorney objected. Irrelevant? But the judge snapped. I'll decide relevance. Continue. Sarah nodded. Even setting land aside, Mr. Johnson's found documents that change everything. I opened the metal box, heart pounding, and held up the 1952 agreement. These easement contracts grant my family perpetual override authority over utility modifications on our 2,100 acres, including Meadowbrook's lines. The Northeast Power attorney's eyes widened. Sarah explained, regardless of surface ownership, the Johnsons control the power infrastructure. Gasps echoed. Karen went pale. Judge Reynolds peered at the papers. These look authentic. Northeast's counsel stood. We've verified them, genuine and binding. We're reinstating Mr. Johnson with back pay. Karen exploded. Absurd, those are ancient. They require my consent for your plans, I said quietly. The judge silenced her outburst, and I knew Mom's legacy was fighting back from beyond the grave. The courtroom buzzed as Judge Reynolds tapped her gavel, eyes narrowing at Karen's outburst. Mrs. Thompson, control yourself, she warned sharply. Sarah seized the moment, her voice cutting through the tension. Your Honor, we have more. During Mrs. Johnson's cancer treatments, the HOA systematically harassed her and falsified documents. She opened Mom's journal, aligning it with medical records and annexation papers, dates matching perfectly when Mom was incapacitated. And we have recordings, Sarah added, pressing play on a flash drive. Karen's voice crackled through. She'll be dead soon anyway, just backdate the papers and we'll deal with any kid who inherits later. The room froze in stunned silence. Karen stammered, that's edited, Sarah cut in, authenticated by 2 independent experts. Judge Reynolds' face darkened, her fingers tightening on the gavel. Based on this evidence, I'm issuing an immediate freeze on all development activities pending a criminal investigation. Sheriff, secure the property today. 3 hours later, I stepped into blinding sunlight, reporters swarming. How's it feel to beat a powerful HOA? Will you press charges? What about Meadowbrook's power? I raised my hands. My family's farmed this land for generations. We've always been good neighbors. I never wanted this fight, just what's ours. Cameras flashed as Karen was escorted to a police car, her eyes flicking to mine before dropping away. That evening, I sat on Mom's porch steps, Sheriff Adams overseeing the removal of construction equipment from my fields. My phone rang nonstop, neighbors, friends, even Jack Thompson offering a settlement. Sarah pulled up with sandwiches. The DA wants to meet tomorrow about charges, she said, handing me one. Northeast Power's CEO apologized personally. What about Meadowbrook residents? I asked. Legally, their homes are fine, she replied, but the HOA's likely finished once the fraud's confirmed. 6 weeks later, the farmhouse hummed again, power crews under my supervision as reinstated regional manager with a raise installed new lines. The doorbell rang. Doug Wilson stood there, awkward with former HOA members. We wanted to apologize, he said. Karen and Jack convinced us you were blocking progress. We didn't know about the fraud. I studied them, then stepped aside. Come in. We should talk. Around the kitchen table, coffee steamed as neighbors who'd once been foes spoke honestly. Most had bought Karen's promises of rising property values. Elaine Foster, an elderly widow, asked, "What happens to our neighborhood now?" "That's up to you," I said, "but I have ideas." 2 months later, autumn gilded the cornfields as Pine Grove Valley neighbors, farmers and ex-Meadowbrook residents, gathered in my renovated barn. Kids chased each other over hay bales while adults hashed out the new Pine Grove Valley Community Association, a democratic replacement for the defunct HOA. Sarah joined me at the window. "Your mother'd be proud," she said softly. Outside, workers swapped the last Harvest Estates sign for a wooden plaque. Johnson Family Farm, Est 1897. I watched fireflies spark over the fields. You know what I learned, Sarah? Mom fought so hard, real power isn't control, money, or fancy houses. It's standing up for what's right, even alone. Dusk settled over the 2,100 acres, now shielded by conservation easements I'd secured, Mom's legacy undivided for generations. Justice had clawed its way through, against all odds. The next morning, I walked the eastern field, soil crunching underfoot. The bulldozer's scars were fatting, grass creeping back. My work phone buzzed, routine grid update, but I let it ring, breathing in the quiet. For the first time since Mom's death, I felt her beside me not in grief, but in triumph. The land was ours again, and I'd made sure it'd stay that way. Karen and Jack faced trial soon, their empire crumbling, but that fight was for the courts now. Here in the golden light, it was just me, the farm, and the promise I'd kept. The morning sun spilled over the eastern field, casting long shadows across the soil where Mom had planted her first crop decades ago. I walked the rows, boots sinking into the earth, feeling the weight of generations beneath me. The scars from the bulldozers were softening, nature reclaiming what was hers just as I had. My work phone buzzed in my pocket, a routine grid update from Northeast Power, but I let it hum unanswered. After months of chaos, this quiet moment belonged to me and the land. I'd secured conservation easements, locking the 2,100 acres into an unbreakable trust. No developer could touch it now, not in my lifetime or beyond. Mom's legacy stood firm, a living monument to her fight and mine. Back at the farmhouse, the porch railing gleamed with fresh blue paint, her spring ritual reborn in my hands. Inside, the kitchen table, once buried under legal battles, now held a single framed photo. Mom smiling in the cornfield, Dad's arm around her, me a kid at their feet. The war was over, but its echoes lingered. Karen and Jack Thompson's trial loomed a week away, the district attorney building a case from Mom's journals, those damning recordings, and the forged signatures. Sarah called it airtight, fraud, elder abuse, even conspiracy charges. "They're scrambling," she'd told me over coffee yesterday. "Their lawyers are offering plea deals, but the DA wants jail time." I didn't care about revenge, just justice. The Meadowbrook HOA had dissolved, its assets seized for restitution, though most residents stayed, forming the Pine Grove Valley Community Association with my help. We met twice now, hashing out bylaws over potluck dinners in the barn. Elaine Foster, once a quiet widow, had taken the lead, her voice steady as she proposed a community garden on the old HOA clubhouse lot. "Something good out of all this mess," she'd said, and I'd agreed. Doug Wilson and the others who'd apologized stuck around too, their guilt softening into a cautious trust. We weren't friends yet, but neighbors, close enough. Northeast Power had more than reinstated me. They'd promoted me to regional manager, tacking on a raise and a formal apology from the CEO. Jack's board seat was gone, his influence torched by the 1952 easement clause Mom had hidden like a time bomb. That rusted metal box still sat in the storm's cellar, a relic of her foresight. I'd traced the power lines on the grid map last night, marveling at how they spiderwebbed from our land to every corner of the county, Substation 12 humming under my oversight. The leverage it gave me wasn't just legal, it was visceral, a pulse of control I'd wielded to stop Harvest Estates cold. My phone buzzed again, this time Sarah. "DA, pushing for a meeting today," she said. "They've got new evidence, bank records showing HOA funds funneled to Jack's zoning buddies. Want to join?" I hesitated, glancing at the fields. "I'll be there," I said finally. "This ends clean." Driving into town, I passed the courthouse where news vans had swarmed weeks ago. Now it was quiet, but the memory of that day, Karen's pale face, the judge's gavel, stayed sharp. I'd stood alone then, but not really. Mom's voice had carried me through every word. The meeting was quick, the DA a wiry man with a handshake like iron. "We've got them dead to rights," he said, sliding bank statements across the table. "Thompson's cronies flipped testimony ties Karen to the forgeries directly." Sarah smirked. "Told you it was airtight." I nodded, signing off on my statement as a witness. Outside, the air smelled of coming rain, the valley stretching green and gold beyond the town's edge. I drove home slow, radio off, letting the silence settle. The farm waited, its lights flickering on as dusk crept in, a beacon of what we'd saved. Tomorrow, I'd meet the community association again, but tonight it was just me and the land, bound by a promise kept. Rain pattered against the farmhouse roof as I sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands. The valley stretched out under a gray sky, the cornfield swaying gently, 100 acres of unbroken legacy, safe now under the conservation easements I'd fought for. The trial had started yesterday. Karen and Jack Thompson sat stone-faced in court while the DA laid out Mom's journals, the forged signatures, and the bank records tying their scheme together. Witnesses, former HOA cronies, had turned their testimony cold and precise. Sarah texted me after day one. "They're done. Plea talks collapsed. Jail's certain." I didn't need to be there. My part was over, the evidence I'd handed over speaking louder than I ever could. Justice wasn't loud or vengeful. It was steady, like the rain soaking the earth Mom had loved. Back inside, the kitchen glowed warm, the photo of her and Dad and me still on the table. I'd added a new one beside it. The community barn packed with neighbors, laughing over shared food, Pine Grove Valley reborn from Meadowbrook's ashes. The Pine Grove Valley Community Association had taken root fast. Last week, we'd broken ground on Elaine Foster's garden, kids from both sides of the old divide digging together while Doug Wilson hauled compost in his truck. "Feels right," he'd said, wiping sweat from his brow, and I'd nodded. The old HOA clubhouse was theirs now, repurposed for meetings and potlucks. No covenants, no fines, just people choosing what mattered. Northeast Power kept me busy, new lines going up across the county, all under my watch as regional manager. The 1952 easement clause stayed my trump card, a quiet power I'd never abuse but always hold. Substation 12 hummed smoothly now, its grid feeding homes without a flicker, a far cry from the overload Coren's luxury homes would have caused. My phone buzzed Emma from the clerk's office. "Records are fully corrected," she said. "Your land's untouchable now." "Thanks," I replied. "Mom'd be glad you were part of this," she laughed softly. "She'd be glad it was you." Later, I walked the western field where the bulldozers had scarred the earth months ago. Grass had overtaken the ruts, wildflowers poking through, a slow healing like mine. The wooden plaque, Johnson Family Farm Est, 1897, stood proud at the gate, a marker of what endured. I thought of Mom's last journal entry, her frail handwriting begging forgiveness for not fighting harder. "You didn't fail," I whispered to the wind. "You gave me everything I needed to win." Her presence lingered in the soil, the trees, the blue railing, every inch we'd saved together. That night the barn hosted another gathering. Lanterns swung from beams as neighbors swapped stories, kids chasing fireflies outside. Sarah found me by the door. "DA called sentencing's next month. Coren's looking at 10 years, Jack 8. I nodded, watching Elaine hand out garden plans. "Good, let's focus on this now," she smiled. "Your mom's legacy's bigger than just land, you know." As stars pierced the sky, I stepped into the field, the crowd's hum fatting behind me. Fireflies danced over the corn, a golden sea stretching to the horizon. I'd stood alone against the HOA, but I hadn't, not really. Mom's fight, her hidden documents, her stubborn love had carried me. Real power, I'd told Sarah, was standing for what's right, even against the odds. Now, with the land secured and a community rebuilt, I felt it. Not control, not revenge, but peace. The farmhouse lights glowed in the distance, a beacon of home. I'd kept my promise, to Mom, to the generations before, to those yet to come. Against all odds, justice had found its way, and this valley, this earth, would tell our story long after I was gone. I turned back to the barn, ready to join the laughter, the future unfolding one steady step at a time.